Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. We are going to be discussing becoming a Fidelity Reviewer again today, so Fidelity Review training for supported employment. So I'm glad you were able to join. We'll be starting here in just a second. I just wanted to say welcome and to say that hopefully you were able to attend the last one. We also have a recording of the last one if you missed out on pieces. We've had, everybody has had technical difficulties. I'm sure you've attended, any number of webinars and virtual trainings where things have kind of gone in and out. And my computer has not been behaving this morning. So I'm hoping that both Paul and Darren have such a strong signal that it'll end up being fine today. But if something happens, either email me, this is Dawn Miller, and we'll see what we can do about getting you back in, or hopefully it'll just go fine. And maybe that's what I should just assume. I was joking with Darren and Paul about the fact that I just got back from my one and only vacation trip this summer and caught a little bitty baby bass and got to pedal a boat on a lake and do a variety of things. So I'm raring to go, and hopefully you are too. So having said that, and it looks like we're up to 17 attendees and growing, we'll go ahead and get started. Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dawn. Welcome back. I think many of us are long overdue for a little getaway into nature at this point in 2020, so I'm a little jealous of you. Dawn and Darren and I were talking before we came on audio, and we decided maybe we'll just go ahead and start with some review, and then just as a transparency, 2020 is kind of my theme. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that I did not make a what I would call a good mark as to where I left off. So if there is something that people want me to go back over, by all means, please let us know in the questions or chat box. And we will factor breaks into the day like the last time we got together. We'll spend sort of the first part of today talking through the Fidelity Scale, kind of finishing that work up. And then we're going to switch gears. We'll move over into talking about the Fidelity review process, some of the particulars of that. We do have some videos, and I'm crossing my fingers that the technology gods are with us today. At a minimum, we'll be able to see the videos with subtitles. I'm not sure if everyone will be able to hear them. That was really where the snag was last time. So long story short, here we go, I suppose. So we thought it best to kind of start with a little review of role of employment supervisor from a Fidelity review perspective. So that's number 5 under the organization section. And really, when you're a Fidelity reviewer, often you come in and you know an awful lot about IPS, and you might be an IPS provider, for example, on the call learning about how to be a Fidelity reviewer. It's important. This is a great example of one of those items where it's important to kind of take a step back from how you do it as a provider and really stick to the knitting of the Fidelity Scale and the Fidelity Review Manual. In fact, I'm going to pull up the Fidelity Review Manual real quickly. I think we were doing that last time, and that goes over pretty well. While I'm finding this section here, tells me that screen sharing is paused. So let me double check here.
And I still hear, I still hear your screen.
Oh, you still hear it?
Yeah, yeah, I do. Maybe the vacation brain hasn't gone away quite as well as I thought.
Maybe. Okay, so I'm experiencing a little glitch on my kind of controls here. All right, let me try to
use the chat screen and let us know whether you can still see the screen. Because I know I can, but that as an organizer, I'm, that it sets it up kind of differently. So please go ahead and use the chat and let us know if you can still see and hear.
And Dawn, does yours, is it on the role of employment supervisor page right now?
It's not. It's still on the Fidelity item page, blue Fidelity item page.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I see, Fidelity items.
Let me see if this works. How about that?
I see Sarah says that she can see and hear, but
okay.
I'm wondering if So which screen are you on right now, Paul?
So right now on my computer, it's got the Fidelity Scale slide.
Okay, that I've got to, so that's good.
Okay, so I paused sharing, screen sharing. Let me see if this works again.
Okay, so now we're back to the intro page, which is probably where we need to be since you paused.
Okay.
And we're back to this. At least from my standpoint, what I see is the blue Fidelity item slide again.
Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and proceed through the Fidelity Review Manual. My computer is telling me the screen sharing is paused when I try to move over to the Fidelity Review Manual electronically. So I'm just going to talk through it, and then I'm going to trust that these kind of glitches, these gremlins, are going to work themselves out over the next couple minutes here.
Or we can also, I could open up the manual and see if I can advance, and you can just tell me when to advance, so we can shift the presenter over to me and see what happens, if you'd like.
Well, maybe that's worth trying, Dawn. And you know, my controls are such that I don't know if I can even transfer the facilitator over to you. You might have to kind of go into your controls and kind of click it over to you.
Okay, I just did, so
okay.
Let me know if you see the manual.
Yep, I see it right now. And in my manual, it's on page 61. So if we have the same versions, it would be right there.
All right.
Or at least be
You're
close.
in which section?
I'm in the role of employment supervisor.
Okay, and I love using the fact that the table of contents has got interactive links, and you can just click on that and it goes.
That is very nice.
Yeah, it is. So role of employment supervisor.
Yep.
Here we go. Here
while
we
you're
are.
clicking through it, perfect. Thank you, Dawn. I really appreciate it. What I was saying before the technology frowned upon me there. Welcome to 2020. It's important as a reviewer to kind of step out of your role as a provider in items like this. You really want to kind of stick to the knitting of the Fidelity Scale. And this is another of those Fidelity items where you are going in and you're looking for components. And for each component, you're going to award a point. And you're relatively locked into some of these. So for role of employment supervisor, really the idea is, you know, we want a champion for work in the organization. We want a supervisor who spends an equal amount of time advocating on behalf of the IPS program and spending time with the IPS program to mentor and develop the staff members in the program. So the first component is they have a supervisor responsible for no more than 10 employment specialists. That ratio can be prorated. So if you are doing a Fidelity review in an organization that has many employment specialists, you know, you really have to start to kind of sketch out the math to see if there's, you know, too little supervision or too much for organizations that have very few employment specialists. I think it's more common to go to an employment agency where they have maybe 2 employment specialists and a full-time supervisor, but the full-time supervisor kind of does other things. And the Fidelity Scale does allow for that. You almost prorate their supervision time based on the number of employment specialists. And really the big ticket items here, you're looking for weekly supervision that reviews client situations. And you know, this is all in notes and meeting minutes that the team should share with you when you show up as a review team. And I talked about a champion for work in the organization. So the supervisor then really, in addition to talking with their own team, needs to be talking with the other mental health treatment team or whatever the appropriate treatment team is. And that's you know, really to help problem solve programmatic issues. And really this comes down to almost in every scenario, referral issues. Either we're not getting enough or they're coming to the employment team incomplete, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So those are really kind of the common themes for problem solvings that an IPS supervisor will be doing with another treatment team leader. but really that champion for the value of work. We want the supervisor, we want to see evidence that the supervisor is attending those other treatment team meetings in addition to their IPS team meetings, and that's on at least a quarterly basis. Good supervision also includes the fourth component here, which is accompanying employment specialists on job development rounds. So the scale says monthly, and often we'll see supervisors who their supervision once a month with an employment specialist is going out either for part or all of their time and having the meeting like in the car in between job development visits. There is some leeway for employment specialists that are really, really good at it, but at the end of the day, there still needs to be some sort of oversight from the supervisor on job development in order to award the point. And then certainly the last bullet point, reviewing current client outcomes with employment specialists and setting goals to improve program performance at least quarterly. High performing organizations have integrated the outcomes or goals into the supervision form, which is really nice, but this is one that's a real challenge as a Fidelity reviewer, or could be a real challenge depending on how the organization has it set up. And I guess an example I would give you is it would not be uncommon to go to an organization and, you know, when you're talking about this specific component, it's in the narrative of the supervision meetings. So if there's meeting minutes, you may find as a reviewer that you have to read an awful lot of them to really get at a score for this section, this component, I should say. And really, so for those 5 components, all of your information for this item is going to be coming to you from an interview with the IPS supervisor, looking at any field mentoring notes or supervision notes, talking with the employment team, also talking with the mental health treatment team leaders. If there's a mental health team or you know, some other relevant team in the organization, it's a very fair question to have in there for your interview. How often does the IPS supervisor come to your team meeting? Again, not as a gotcha, but it's an independent way to kind of validate you know, some of the things that maybe you're hearing from the IPS supervisor or the IPS team. As I look through the remainder of this item, Dawn, if you can scroll a little bit further to the next page. Let's see here. It breaks each component out, and again, I think I shared last time, you know, if you're really wanting to become a Fidelity reviewer, the best thing you can do is get this Fidelity Review Manual and have it with you and consult it when you have a question about any of the items. So it's just got all of the answers you could possibly want, and it even has suggestions for things you might get stuck on. If we look at, let's see here, I'm trying to find a good example to go over here too. So at the bottom of this page that you're on right here, Dawn, is an example, starts the examples for the supervisor time. And so it's important to walk through those. So for the first example, a supervisor is responsible for 12 IPS employment specialists, and we wouldn't give credit for that component because the component is one supervisor is responsible for no more than 10 employment specialists. In the next one, as Dawn is pulling that up here, you see what I would consider to be a pretty realistic scenario. So the supervisor is responsible for IPS with 8 employment specialists and for supervision of an ACT team with 5 case managers and daily ACT team meetings and tracking outcomes for ACT. That's also manualized and also has a Fidelity Scale, by the way, ACT. So in this one, the reviewers would not give credit because it's very difficult for a supervisor to help 2 programs such as these to do all the things you need to do for each of the 2. So in that scenario, we may not give credit. One of the things we might recommend would be adding a supervisor to ACT. We might also recommend having some sort of dyad supervision approach where you've got an ACT team, maybe a team lead that helps with some of the duties. Oh, Dawn, I see your computer uh, his updates, of course.
Of course it does, and I just checked for it said it had none. So,
of course.
Uh,
It's 2020. This is all happening on purpose
yeah.
now at this point.
Oh,
So recommendations we might make as Fidelity reviewers for this item is, kind of splitting some of that workload. And if you know anything about ACT, like I said, it's got its own Fidelity scale. So imagine one person trying to track two different programs with two different Fidelity scales that each have the capability of having Fidelity reviews, for example. Real quickly, it's not hard to say that the supervisor doesn't have enough bandwidth to get that done effectively. So as we kind of move through this, I think the rest is kind of self-explanatory. There's not a lot of, for these with the components, as a reviewer, you're really looking and it's either there or it's not. There's really not a whole lot of other, considerations you need to make, and the onus is on the team to provide that information to you. So, if you want to end day one with a little overview of your scores so far and what you still need to look at tomorrow, then what you can do is, as you get into maybe a little bit before lunchtime on day two, really start to tidy up and say, okay, here's another thing we need to see we haven't seen yet. And at the point of day two, I think it's very fair to just ask the team, we need to see your weekly supervision from your IPS supervisor. And then, the onus is on them to provide it to you. Either they have it or they don't. It's a lot to get through in a 2-day period to evaluate everything and dig for everything. So it's, for organizations, it's really helpful if they can have things prepared. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Dawn, we can move. Go ahead.
One of the things we do in we send out an agenda letter before we do the review, and it gives the agency the things that we want to look at. And one of the things that I've added, this manual actually has an example of that agenda letter. That's what I use, but I've tweaked it a little. And I actually ask in advance for supervision notes, team meeting notes, things along that line, so that we can take a look at those and start to get a feel for how often do they meet and with whom. And typically, we do what you said, which is to ask for things that we're not yet seeing. We kind of do that at the end of day one, the end of day two, or kind of throughout. But we have not typically done scores. And what I just tell folks at the agency that we're doing the review for is that we need a chance to do consensus scoring. In doing reviews, sometimes I find that we have consensus right away, and there's other times that on certain questions I'll see that we definitely don't have consensus. And so, I hold off giving any kind of scores to give some information about things that we're seeing that the agency does well. We try and leave the review with, we really appreciate that you do this, this, and this, because we want the agency to know that we did pay attention to the things that they did well, and it isn't just about recommendations. So that's kind of the way that we've handled.
Yep, and that's pretty consistent. And I know the IPSworks.org group will be coming out with some extended recommendations for continuing Fidelity reviews, I think starting in October 2020 in kind of the COVID era. So there is some guidance on the way to how do we do Fidelity reviews in the world we're living in right now today, and still feel like we're getting a thorough review for the organizations.
Yeah, I do know they've also, I want to say in March or April, they put out not how to do a Fidelity review, but just some considerations for COVID. So that IPSworks.org website just is an amazing wealth of information. And if like 162 items in the library, and you can pick and choose the things that are relevant to you and make sense. So I highly recommend checking it out.
Yeah, they really make it easy, don't they?
They do. They really do. It's not bad.
Yep. We can move into the next item, Dawn, zero exclusion criteria. I think it's on the next page. It might be 2 pages away. So while Dawn's navigating to that zero exclusion criteria, this is a tough one for organizations to quote unquote prove to the reviewers sometimes. And so, really, it is what it sounds like. you're going to go and you're going to do some interviews, and you're going to look at a number of things to try to identify whether all clients interested in working have access to supported employment services, regardless of any sort of readiness factors or anything like that. So some of the simple things that you'll see here, include, while you're there and you've checked in, do you see posters? Do you see brochures that will provide the opportunity for clients to refer themselves to IPS? You're really going to want to look through their intakes. You're really going to want to pay attention in these interviews with the treatment team practitioners, at the IPS employment specialists. And I like to point out, for mental health centers, it is really, if you can get time with a medical prescriber like an MD, or some organizations use advanced practice nurses for prescribing services, there are certainly plenty, and I don't have the research on it, but I would imagine the majority of prescribing staff certainly embrace and adopt, what we're trying to do with IPS supported employment. But there are still some who, were really schooled in sort of a different train of thought, that people need to be compliant with medications before they do anything else. And it's rare in agencies that have IPS, because of the work that goes into rolling out IPS, on a grand scale to an organization. However, there are still some, and it's important in those interviews to just, again, it's not about gotchas or anything like that. We're just trying to collect information. Often you'll be in these interviews, and you might hear from a therapist or something, they don't want to say the wrong answer, and so on and so forth. Well, there's really no wrong answer. It's to an organization's benefit if they're transparent, so that we can give them an accurate score, and so their score can be consistent over time. If people are not transparent with information during the Fidelity review, what could happen is you might have, a high score one year, a low score next year, a middle score the year after, another low score the year after. And then it really kind of comes down to, your score depends on who you put in front of the reviewers. As review teams stick together longer and do this over a period of time, what ends up happening is you start to see those patterns emerge, and your interview questions, can kind of adopt some of that, those hunches that you have. And again, not about gotchas, but we want to give fair and honest scores. So zero exclusion is, I think, and this is just my opinion, I think it is really difficult to be perfect on zero exclusion based on the number of people you interview during a 2-day period. Certainly the easiest thing to do is to put brochures and posters up. That's often, or organizations have that done first. But it really comes down to, it's a reflection of how hardwired employment services are in the agency, and that's why it's here in the Fidelity Scale. We really want to make sure that everybody who has an interest in employment can get it. So Dawn, as you scroll through there, some of the things I'll point out in the examples, for example, the third example down, mental health practitioners require abstinence before referring people to IPS. Then you wouldn't score higher than a 3, for example. And some of that is in the scale here, the Fidelity Scale with the anchors. Let me flip to that real quickly. Well, I flipped right to an example Fidelity report. That's not what I wanted. Hang on one second. All right, so for zero exclusion, that 3 would be that it's really, the gradient is a little gray. So this is where the reviewers can really have a good discussion and some consensus scoring. 5 is easy, right? All clients interested in working have access. 1 is easy. There's a formal policy to exclude clients due to readiness factors or et cetera. when you get into 2s and 3s and 4s, the real gradient becomes most clients is a 2. Most clients are unable to access supported employment. When you get to the score of 3, some clients are unable to access supported employment services. And then you have a score of 4, which is there's no evidence of exclusion, formal or informal. Referrals are not solicited by a wide variety of sources. And et cetera. So there's some specifics in 4, but 2 and 3 really, you know, if you're going to score somebody a 2 or a 3, you really have to have a good discussion with your Fidelity review team about, is it most or is it some clients, and how do you justify that? How do you have evidence that it's some as opposed to most, or most as opposed to some? And so those are things where your Fidelity review team can help you out. You know, you guys want to stay tight and stay close on what are the facts, not what are the hunches. And what did we hear in the interview, and what did we see when we were getting this all put together? Some of those other, let's see here. When this second one from the bottom, when programs do not have mechanisms for clients to refer themselves, the score is not higher than 4. So if the organization doesn't have any, you know, more a client to kind of walk in and say they're interested in employment, or identify to staff, I'm interested in employment. If it's only at intake they ask, for example, those are some things that might be evidence of that particular example right there. Dawn, we can go to the next one, the next page, I should say. We can keep scrolling down, Dawn. All right, the next one that we can talk about is the agency focus on competitive employment. And it's similar. This kind of builds off of no exclusion. Dawn, when you get a chance, if you could scroll to the next page. Here we're looking to see, you know, does the agency promote work? And this is another item with components, with multiple 5 components, and for each component they get a point. So
evidently, Paul, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
My connection had been lost and now is reestablished, so I apologize if I'm not keeping up with asking. Is component 3 on competitive employment the one that you want to see?
That might be. So I was just starting to talk about agency focus, so you can stay right there. That's okay. You don't have to move around too much. I figured something happened to you. So on this one, with the components, you know, we want to see the intake, and I think we did talk, I know this might be a review, we did talk about this last time, because I think we talked about, if I remember correctly, how some organizations call, you know, an assessment an intake, but there are other organizations that, you know, when a client first connects with an organization, there's an intake process that happens, and then based on whatever the intake contains, then the client is kind of referred to or moved to the appropriate kind of service division. And so it's important as a reviewer to really understand the intake process. And the reason I say that is if there's let's say a mental health assessment that has questions about interest in employment on it, that's great. But if there are 2 intakes in front of that mental health assessment that don't ask questions about employment, then you really have to have a discussion about, well, what about those people who had an interest in employment but never got to the team that gives the mental health assessments? And it's almost kind of going back to that no exclusion sort of idea. Are we excluding people informally and inadvertently and on accident? But it's important to really have those discussions. So we'd look to see questions about interest in employment on all annual assessments or treatment plan reviews. Again, here we're looking for written postings, brochures, bulletin boards, posters in other, what I would call common areas. It could be a lobby, could be a waiting area. Every agency is a little bit different. So if there's a clubhouse where people congregate, clients congregate, a clubhouse would be an ideal location. for IPS related paperwork. The next bullet point is, the next component is one where some agencies struggle, supporting ways for clients to share work stories with other clients and staff at least twice a year. Some agencies have this hardwired and it's like easy peasy for them. Others really struggle to kind of have that forum where clients who have had success in work can come back and talk to other clients. For folks that are doing it very, very well, that might look like, you know, an annual kickoff event. There might be groups that are happening in an organization and they have as a guest speaker clients that come back, clients who are employed that come back. So that one can be a challenge for folks. And then the last one can be a real challenge for folks. The agency measures rates of competitive employment on at least a quarterly basis and shares outcomes with agency leadership and staff. If you remember last time we talked about kind of getting IPS into QA, into the QA kind of world where outcomes are tracked, and this is a great example of an outcome that can be tracked that gives an agency credit at a couple different items. I think I muted myself there on accident. I apologize. So that, and it's important to note too that the agency should measure the rates of competitive employment for all clients served by the agency, not just those who are in the IPS program. So that's an important distinction to make, I think.
And it's a good catch because I think a lot of agencies, including the one that I worked for, didn't do that initially and then started to because of IPS.
Sure. And it's in that scenario, I'm glad you brought that up, Dawn. It's not wrong for them to measure the competitive employment for people working with the IPS team. It's just that the Fidelity Scale requires kind of a more stringent measure. So they want to know for all clients, not just those working with the employment team. We can move to the next one, Dawn. The next one is executive team support. Another one with components. You know, this is, to me, this can go a couple ways. I mean, you're not going to walk, as a Fidelity reviewer, you're probably not going to walk into an organization that has an IPS team, and during the Fidelity review, you're not going to hear anybody from the leadership team say, we don't support IPS, we don't think it's worthwhile. You know, I mean, I just don't think you're going to hear that. I've never heard it, or, you know, I mean, and I don't think I ever will. What you're really looking for here is kind of to what degree, if you remember I talked about hardwiring IPS into the organization, you know, we're really looking for, and first things first, before I get too far into this item, it's got some examples of who the executive team could be on this item. It is important as a Fidelity review team on day one, usually there's some sort of kind of welcome to the agency sort of meeting, like a 15 or 20 minute, you know, here's who's who. And that's an opportunity for you to understand from the organization, who do they consider their executive team? And then that's the notion you use for the next 2 days. So not every agency specifically has a CEO. Maybe they have an executive director. Maybe the chief operating officer is also the QA director. You know, so not every agency has all of these positions. And so it's important for you to flesh out on day one, who are we considering the executive director? Who are we considering the clinical director? Who's in charge of QA, for example? Maybe that's not a director, and that's okay. We just need to understand from the agency on day one who we're talking about in this item, for example. And then going forward, you know, when you have the interview with the executive team members, whoever they are, we would expect that they would, you know, demonstrate some sort of what I call basic knowledge regarding supported employment. They might not be able to articulate all of the principles word for word. They may not be able to, you know, get into the nitty gritty of the Fidelity Scale. But, you know, what you really want to hear from them is, why is employment important to them? And why do they think it's important for the folks that they serve? And what happens is, naturally, they're going to kind of end up talking about a principle anyway, if those things are true. I'll tell you a funny story. One time I went and did a Fidelity review, and we were doing the, often in a Fidelity review, you'll kind of, as reviewers, you'll kind of split up to get everything accomplished. And so I was meeting with the executive team by myself, and we were meeting in the boardroom of this organization. And when I walked in, the employment supervisor walked me into the boardroom, and no one else had gotten into the room yet. And I said, "Can I sit anywhere?" And she said, "Sure." So I went and I sat at a chair, and there was paper at each setting at the table, this big conference table. And I looked down at the paper while I was putting my things down, and it is it was an IPS. It was IPS talking points, and it was very clear to me that someone had sat down with the executive team and given them IPS talking points to coach them through their interview with me. And you know, it's kind of funny. It's not wrong just because I found out about it. It's good work in principle to talk with the executive team and say, well, here are the things that are important about the program. And it wasn't a set of talking points that said, here's what the principles are, here's what the specifics are. It was more of an agency specific talking point, kind of like you know, here's how we do this, here's how we do that, here's how we do the other. And so, me being me, I'm a transparent sort of guy. I just kind of asked everybody, did they have their copy? And they all kind of looked at me with sheepish grins. And we just kind of talked through why that would be, you know, part of the process pre-Fidelity review. And it turns out they had that meeting, I think, the evening before the Fidelity review, and the cleaning company or whoever didn't clean those off the tabletop. And I said, listen, you know, I'm glad you have an IPS supervisor that wants to bring you up to speed on the most recent developments with their program. You know, nobody's going to lose any points because of it. It's just kind of a funny story to find that.
You know, and my attitude is, you know, even if it was learning about IPS the night before, it was still learning about IPS. It still accomplished the purpose.
Right.
The executive team knew more about IPS, so you know, it's all good.
So, you know, after we got done laughing about it, one of the things I said was, well, I'm not going to ask you any of these questions, that's for sure. And you know, they knew about IPS. We all agreed to chalk it up to kind of an over-anxious IPS supervisor who wanted to make sure they knew what they needed to know. And I was convinced after talking with them that they knew it anyway, but the supervisor, they were humoring the supervisor, I think, more than anything. Funny stuff. Yeah, I mean, really. So another component of this item here is the QA process. You know, and I've been to some agencies, just to be real clear, they don't have what I would call a formal QA process, and that's okay. Again, you have to kind of understand from them. Most agencies have some sort of requirement, either through accreditation or affiliation, that requires them to track certain outcomes or data to show that they're doing good work. And so really, whether they call it QA or some call it continuous quality improvement or CQI, you know, there's all kinds of names for what quality assurance is. And it's important to just find out, roll up your sleeves into day one and find out some of these things. What is your QA process? Do you have one? Do you have data that gets reported to your board, or do you get data that gets shared with your employees, et cetera, et cetera? And once you find that out, some of these things begin to get a little easier to score. But the Fidelity Review, or the Fidelity Scale, says really we're looking for an explicit review of the supported employment program at least every 6 months, or until achieving high fidelity. Once you achieve high fidelity, it's at least annually. So it's prescriptive in a way, but it stops short of saying exactly what needs to be measured. So it's really important to talk through with organizations, what do they currently measure? And chances are, even if they can't articulate to you, you know, specific items from the Fidelity Scale that are measured, chances are things they're measuring are Fidelity Scale items. Maybe they're worded in a little, you know, different way. But again, if you think this is all, none of this is about gotchas. This is really to help people and empower organizations to improve their programming. You know, we can have that discussion as Fidelity reviewers about, well, you know, it's not specifically a Fidelity Scale item because of the wording. Maybe we can give them credit, but really recommend that they change the wording to be a lock for Fidelity Scale language. Those are all okay conversations to have as Fidelity reviewers. The next component is a steering committee meeting. Steering committees look a lot of different ways, but this is really requiring that somebody from that executive team we talked about would participate in the steering committee meeting. And so I guess here's what I'd say about that. I've seen a lot of different ways that people do steering committees. The organizations that do it have it hardwired. They invite somebody from their executive team, and that person attends those meetings. Other organizations have the invitation with the understanding that somebody from the executive team maybe can't attend every single meeting due to their schedule. And so it's really important to look at the meeting minutes for the steering committee. They should have them. They should be able to produce them when you're there. If you're looking at 12 months of steering committee meeting minutes and somebody from the executive team is invited but they have never attended, it's very fair to ask about that. And ideally, your review team will know, if there was a review in the prior year, did you see the same thing? And maybe they're just inviting the person and they never attend, because that is something worth talking about with the organization as a way to get better. The next component, agency CEO or executive director communicates how IPS services support the mission of the agency and articulates clear goals for supported employment to all agency staff during the first 6 months and at least annually. So on this, you would expect to see, for example, maybe a kickoff if supported employment is a new thing at an organization, where the executive director kind of links all of this together. Making it part of orientation for new employees is another way to hardwire this into an organization that you might see. And so you might see orientation logs, or a lot of places do orientation online where they kind of look at modules like webinars almost. And so you can just ask, where is, it's hard to know what that evidence would look like. So you do need to lean on the IPS agency to tell you what it looks like, but it is okay, again, to say, we haven't seen how the CEO communicates how IPS supports the mission yet. Where would we find that? And again, this looks a variety of ways. Some organizations have CEOs that have all staff meetings quarterly, where they talk about things like IPS and that sort of thing. Any way you can get evidence of that is really what you need to see in order to award the points for it. And as I flip over to the Fidelity Scale, again, really each component gets a point, and so the 5 would be everything is present. The last component, the supported employment program leader sharing information about barriers with the executive team at least twice a year. Again, ideally, you'd see some sort of meeting minutes to show this. In the event that they don't have meeting minutes, sometimes what you hear is that IPS supervisor, let's say Jane, meets with the executive director once a quarter, where they talk only about IPS and what we can do to get better about IPS. And so there may not be meeting specifically from that quarterly meeting with the executive director, but I would expect, in the absence of minutes, that the IPS supervisor mentions it and mentions the frequency. I would expect that in the interview with the executive team that they mention that, oh, Jane, yeah, she meets with the executive director once every quarter, and we've been doing that for 2 years or whatever. Those are the things I would need to, really give that score with some certainty. And I think, looking through the examples, Dawn, as you start to scroll a little bit, I don't think there's anything kind of wild that I could point out in the examples. They're all pretty straightforward. This is one of those, if it's there, and you see it and have evidence of it, you can award the point. And those are the most straightforward, certainly, for sure.
Oh,
go ahead, Dawn.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I stopped where it says when the IPS supported employment program is not part of a mental health agency, because we have a lot of agencies like that are not mental health agencies. So this piece might be worth going through.
That's a good point.
Just because I think it would be helpful.
Sure. So as Dawn pointed out here, there is some specific guidance about, how does it play out when you've got an IPS program, but you are not a part of a mental health agency. And so this one is going to be, as we talk this through, this is going to be similar to some items that we'll talk about a little bit later where you might be leaning on another agency to help you with the score. Like there's IPS agencies also get rated on their collaboration with VR, for example. So if the relationships take two in order to be successful. So if I won't talk about that one, I'll talk about that one later. I'll talk about this one right now. So the idea here is this has got to break out of all 5 components and how you'd score all 5 components if IPS is at agency A, mental health services are at agency B. So the first component, you see what they do is they've kind of brought in executive leadership from the other agency, agency B or the mental health agency. And the idea is that that agency's leadership, even though they're not the agency getting an IPS review, that agency's leadership has at least some basic understanding of why supported employment is important for the folks they serve. And if you trace that back, what I would say is the agencies have entered into, at a minimum, some sort of informal arrangement where IPS services are available from agency A to agency B's clients. So somebody in both agencies had an agreement in the middle that it's important enough that we can work on it. So it should be easy. I think the more likely problem in this component is that the agency B, mental health agency, executive director may not be available to talk with during the fidelity review. And so those, while they have never really advocated that interviews be by phone only, there are times where in order to get the interview completed, you have to have a quick phone interview. And that, the best example I have is when you're scheduled to talk with an MD or an APRN and this is a playbook for those of you on the call who are IPS providers that are wanting to connect with a non-IPS agency to provide IPS services to those agencies. So think about how do you structure the discussion with an agency you're trying to get into this sort of arrangement. And then the 5th component only applies to the IPS staff. this item here. The idea that the IPS agency is communicating with, or the program, the IPS supervisor is communicating with the executive team at least twice a year. So I think, and it has a module there, executive director interview. I don't think that includes any interview questions about an agency with an arrangement like this, if I remember correctly. But this is a good place to pause, Dawn. You're exactly right. And this might be a place if people out there have questions on how it looks, it's a good opportunity for them to ask too.
Absolutely. So let's take, shall we take a 10-minute break, come back at
Sure.
10 and Paul, if you want to try your screen again so that it's not, I apologize to the folks listening that it's been a little awkward in regards to showing the screen, but I know we're doing the best we can. So, but Paul, maybe you could try start, I can turn it over to you and we'll see if it'll work for you again.
Sure, that's fine.
So 10-minute break, come back at 10, please. And we'll see what we can do from our end. So I'm going to turn over the screen. Let's do this the right way. Change presenter to Paul. Yes, you're doing that. And let's see what happens. So I've stopped presenting.
Okay.
You still there, Paul?
I'm still here. I'm
okay.
still here.
Okay. And I turned it over to you, at least screen on your end that says, do you want to be the presenter? Yes or no?
All
Did
right.
you get that?
I did, and I think it's showing the PowerPoint Fidelity Review, Fidelity Scale.
Okay.
And now it's going back to screen sharing is paused. It kind of automatically does that. I don't know why.
So it's probably not going to work.
That's really
for
bizarre.
you to be the presenter right at the moment.
Okay. Well, hang on, because I think maybe I understand what's happening. So it's telling me that there's another window on top of my shared application. So it must be doing that automatically. So let me fix. I think I need to fix it in the sharing section.
Okay.
When you select share, you can select share my screen or share.
Yeah. Just a window or share your screen are a couple of the options.
Right.
And just the window is nice because it keeps them out of, if you forget to minimize your email or whatever, that nobody really wants to see. Now I see blue screen.
Okay. I think it automatically paused again.
Okay. So
I'm working on it. It's a little glitchy and slow, but I think I had it on show application only, and what I should do is show my screen.
Probably. We're back to the intro screen, so that's okay. For a start, let's see what we've got here. Okay, so Nicolina had said, what's her name? That she could see the screen when I was asking, and I now see your Fidelity item slide again. So I think we're back to you being able to do it, at least for the moment.
Let me see. Okay, I think I got it fixed. So like everything else in 2020, Dawn, I just did it wrong the first time. So now I have it fixed.
Good deal. Okay.
I did notice there's a question in the chat, and is that from you? It says it's from GoTo 500.
Oh, it's for me, Paul.
Oh, okay.
It was just we're having more contracts with agencies who are non-behavioral health agencies, so I was just looking for some additional information.
Maybe that's a good place to start when we jump back on with everybody. It is complicated, and it's like other things in the Fidelity Scale. It takes another entity to get scored appropriately on it, and so there's a short list of ways to make it perfect and a longer list of ways that it's entirely imperfect. So I mean, I can tell you when I tell people how to get a high score doing it, everybody's like, well, yeah, right. That'd be easy if I could do that.
Yeah.
A
Darren,
lot of
I
it
probably need to give historical information in regards to stuff that we've done too that you maybe don't have yet. Because, you know, Paul can talk about the global kind of thing, but much like, or it sounds like in Illinois, you give them scores kind of throughout. We don't. So there's differences state to state that we have to be kind of aware of as we're talking to. So.
Yep, and we're real clear too, Dawn, just so you like catch my meaning. So when I say like we give scores throughout, we do a couple of things. So the reviewers come together throughout day one, like probably near the end of day one, let's say 4 o'clock, and then usually a little bit before noon on day two, we kind of do what we call preliminary scoring, where we're alone in the room and we identify what do we have evidence that we can score, we can arrive at a score for. As far as giving them scores, we do an exit interview where we give them like the score sheet and we tell them that's a preliminary score. But essentially our conversation with them at that point is, here are the things we think you do great, keep doing those, and then here are the things we think are going to end up being opportunities for you. And they have the opportunity when they see that preliminary scoring sheet to say, well, why did you give us a 3 on, you know, collaboration with VR? And we tell them, well, you know, here's what we saw and here's what we heard while we were here. And I think I've shared with you before, Dawn, I am kind of a stickler. You know, if they don't get it to us within the 2-day period where they're fidelity reviewing, I'm not going to score it 6 weeks later when they mail it to me via email or something. I can't do it.
Yeah.
And so there are differences between states, but we always pitch it as preliminary for sure.
Yeah, we definitely do scores. And in fact, I'd read in the manual at one point in time, and it recommends not to.
Yeah,
until
I know.
you've done scoring, and so that's the reason why we do it that way, is we're, you know, kind of following what they recommend in the manual. We do tell them the positive things that we've done. We do as a team, you know, when we weren't doing them virtually, and very honestly we are now, we would sit there and we'd say, do we have enough on this one or that one or whatever else, and determine if we have to ask for more stuff. And as a reviewer, just because I'm a soft touch, I always give them a week afterwards to send me stuff. After that, it's a cutoff. Usually our consensus scoring is you know, within that week, and so I give them the kind of up until consensus stuff. Actually, that's not true. I give them until a couple of days after consensus scoring, because in this consensus scoring meeting, we come up with things potentially where we haven't had enough information or aren't clear and ask for more. And especially with the virtual, it's not my favorite thing, but I also understand that in the state of Washington, the intent was, part of it, probably a big part of it, was we incentivized the reviews, and there were agencies failing because they didn't have enough income. And we wanted to do what little we could do to put a halt to that by continuing to do the reviews. I mean, $10,000 is not gonna, you know, it's small potatoes in the scheme of things, well, in some cases, but it might be just enough to keep an agency afloat until they can get services running as well as they might want again. So, you know, is it wrong to have done what we did? I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I think we're trying to help agencies out, and that's still the bottom line.
Yep, and there is a lot of flexibility even within the scale to do that, I think, as a reviewer. And it, you know, as like a administrator at a state level, you know, I mean, I think there are some things that you just have to make work in the state, because each state, like you said, each state kind of interprets every rule that's out there just a little bit differently, or differently enough that even though I've done fidelity reviews in a couple different states, it's entirely different in every state that I've been to. You know, there's a state that I went to that only supports IPS for a very specific 5-year grant. And, you know, you go to an agency and you're doing a fidelity, I was brought in as part of that grant. So you go in and you do a fidelity review, and you can only review according to the rules that state has in place. They only wanted us to do a fidelity review for the grant related work. But the challenge is when you go to the agency, they got, you know, 6 employment specialists, and you spend the first day trying to figure out what's grant and what's not grant. And then at the end of the day, it's like, well, you got 6 employment specialists and I can only review one of them. I mean, why am I'm here for 2 days reviewing one person. I mean, that's silly.
Wow.
So, and it messes everything else up too, because the organizational language isn't split up with all the grants like that. It's just kind of like, yeah, that everybody gets
Mm-hmm.
employment. You know, so how do you do no
Mm-hmm.
exclusion? How do you evaluate no exclusion when there are people who are not eligible for the grant and aren't getting IPS services?
Yeah.
You know, like that's a real conundrum as a reviewer to
Mm-hmm.
be in.
Is absolutely. Looks like we're at 10 o'clock, and hopefully folks have returned from their kind of mini break. And Paul, we went back to the introductory screen. Did you do that deliberately, or are we having?
I think I did it deliberately.
Oh, you did, because there's
Yep.
your screen. Good deal.
Yep. So I popped it back on there.
Go ahead.
So it looks like we had a question right before break. And so I'll just read it. The question is, hi, Paul. HCA is contracting more with agencies that are not behavioral health providers. I did not realize how complicated the process is now. Do you have any additional information that you can share about this process? And so the easy short version of my answer to that question is yes, I have additional information I can share. After that, it gets a lot more complicated. I brought the Fidelity Manual up to, so it's page 91 here. But I'm looking at this particular example, and it says here, an IPS program is implemented in a rehab agency that does not provide mental health treatment. And so I think, talking with you, Dawn, that's a pretty common arrangement in Washington. Maybe common isn't the right word, but you guys are seeing that more and more.
Pretty frequent.
Yeah,
it's pretty frequent. And Paul,
okay.
I don't know if you're showing that. Oh, now it's showing up on your screen, maybe that it's moving. Sorry.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
So going on with the example, the IPS specialist coordinates services with the local mental health agency practitioners. So I'm going to stop right there, because that's, in principle, for this item, what you'd need to do as an IPS provider in order to be scored, as we saw before the break. You know, in this item, you got to figure out how do you coordinate your services with the local mental health agency. Kind of continuing through the example, the IPS supervisor meets with the executive team of the rehab agency at least twice a year to discuss the status of the IPS program. She does not meet with the executive team at the mental health agency. Reviewers give credit. And so here they've got a note, while it is not a requirement for the IPS supervisor to meet with the executive team at the mental health agency, one member of the executive team from the mental health agency attends the IPS steering committee at the rehab agency and learns about implementation challenges. So we saw that before the break. So on one hand, you know, I like this example because it shines a light on exactly what this question asks, but you know, it really does kind of reiterate some of what we read right before the break. And so here's what I'll say about you know, an IPS organization that's trying to coordinate with, whether it's a mental health agency or whether it's, you know, another agency, and there's all kinds of agencies that, you know, we could be talking about. It is difficult. There are very few times when I see it where it's easy and streamlined and exactly as represented in the Fidelity Scale. A lot of it boils down to, I want to say competing priorities, but I'm not even sure it's competing priorities. I think it's just both agencies are busy with what they need to be busy with, and so when you try to find a place to meet in the middle, it doesn't work every time. So,
right.
You know, I mean, if you think about what an IPS agency is asking of a mental health provider, you're saying, hey, we have this rule we need to follow. Will you come do what this rule says we need to have you do? You know, you got to come meet with us. We got to come meet with you. You got to be on our steering committee. Often, you know, and I'm not going to get too far off the center on this, but, you know, over the last 25 years in the healthcare field, we continually are being asked to do more and more with less and less. And I think a big part of this problem for organizations is it's a bandwidth problem. You know, the IPS agency doesn't have the bandwidth maybe to do their own mental health services, and the mental health teams don't, you know, mental health agencies don't have the bandwidth to start their own IPS programming. So you'd think if nobody could do it on their own, they should do it together and it would be easy peasy. But the reality is carving out the time to meet all the criteria that's in the Fidelity Scale. So,
right.
So what I kind of default to when I'm talking with organizations is, listen, at the end of the day, you got to do what works. So the most important thing is the collaboration and the relationship. So it's not worth blowing up the relationship just because they don't have anybody that can sit on the steering committee. Maybe that's a place where an IPS agency says, you know what, we know we're not going to get this point today or right now because we need someone else in order to make it happen. And so maybe that's just, I'm a big fan of fidelity plans, and if you're a reviewer, you walk into an agency that is trying to connect with a mental health treatment team, if they have an item in their fidelity plan that says, we'll call every 3 months to see if it's a good time to start these discussions about how we can integrate more closely per the fidelity items. If I see that and it hasn't happened yet, that's about as good as the IPS team can do. That's what's within their control. That's their plan. I wouldn't be able to give them credit, full credit for some of the components, but they have a plan, and it might be that they need to wait until the mental health agency has a new hire. Maybe they need a new manager or a new director or something, additional to spread their bandwidth out. But I also know what's great about a plan like that is our industry in healthcare, we are champions of change. That's what we do, right? We help people change. We're resilient with changes. We get funding changes all the time, and everything is changing all around us all the time, and we roll with it, and we help our clients roll with it. So I think for an organization, and even for HCA, to be real honest, I think the guidance is you do the best you can with what you've got and what you have control over. And it's not a great answer, but there's nothing algorithmic about trying to have someone else follow your rules. That's the hard part.
I would say too, Paul, that when you're talking about considerations, I know the agencies that serve people because they're trying to help improve the person's quality of life.
Right.
And so what is beneficial to the person is and should be one of the primary considerations. When you look at the data that we have related to foundational community supports, IPS, and supportive housing for that matter, around 90% of the people being served have a mental health condition, diagnosable mental health condition, in some cases actively receiving services. And so we know there's a high percentage, really high percentage of folks out there that have a diagnosable condition, whether or not they're receiving the mental health services. So it behooves us to figure out how to work together.
Right.
For the individuals we're serving, it behooves us to figure out how to work together. And so that's one of the bottom lines in my mind too, is how do we do that? And how does HCA help that to happen? And I know we've talked to mental health agencies about being that collaborative party if they're not providing IPS. We've also frankly talked to them about becoming IPS providers. So
Sure.
I think there's ways that we've discussed that from our end in regards to how to promote it. So
yeah, and there's a kind of a bind too, because at some point, if I'm an IPS agency that has a mental health agency down the road and we're trying to collaborate with them, there's almost a sense of urgency in my opinion, because if I'm not able to successfully collaborate with them and make it worth their while to have a collaborative relationship with me, I would be worried that they would decide to become an IPS agency.
Sure.
And then all of a sudden I have competition down the road. Anything that it's a relationship, and again, the hard part about a relationship is that it takes another person to make it work. So anything IPS agencies can be doing to make a direct line between that collaborative supported employment work and the mental health agency's mission, vision, values, et cetera, will help. Anything that an IPS agency can do to make a direct line from how their successes in supported employment impact the mental health treatment team in a positive way will be really, really beneficial and vital to that relationship. So, IPS agencies should be trying to get data, for example, on, once the mental health agency refers somebody to supported employment, are we doing things like helping them attend meetings with their mental health treatment team more regularly? Are we improving appointment compliance? Are they seeing treatment outcomes based on our supported employment work that we can draw a circle around and say, see, we can help you too. You guys don't have to just send us the referral and then not think about employment. You can bring us into the fold as a team member, as a collaborative team member.
Really good point.
It's hard to do, and there's like an arc to the relationships most of the time, where they start off with both agencies dipping toes in each other's water, and ideally you can move into, somebody really doing a cannonball into the deep end, but it takes time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's probably the most exciting metaphor I've had all week, even though it's Tuesday.
It came off of my being on a lake and vacation, and that cannonball, kind of a mentality just flowed from that.
I hear you. Yeah, I hear you. So it's another part of this that doesn't have a nice clear-cut answer. And when you're to kind of bring it back to why we're all here together, if you think about a Fidelity review, it's likely that this question might come up, right, in a Fidelity review for the review team. And so how do you answer a question that doesn't really have an answer? What you do is you talk with the team about, well, what have you done and how has that gone? And what are the barriers? And you really start to push that through. And then again, as a Fidelity reviewer, I think it's important to I guess I'd expect to see that the IPS supervisor has identified this as a real barrier to the executive team in the IPS agency. So then when you're talking with the IPS, executive team, you can be kind of inquiring about, what have they done to help this along? Sometimes executive to executive communication is what gets these things moving. The clinicians maybe want to have the ideal state, but for whatever reason, the executives haven't yet had a chance to really push it forward. And you'll see throughout all of this, IPS really is about the leadership of agencies hardwiring this as a practice. We are going to do this. This does support our mission. This is the way we will help people through recovery, is through employment. So if all of those things are true, then I would expect, that the executive, this would be an example of something the executive team or executive director could talk about and speak to in an interview. And they don't have to air all the dirty laundry about why it's not where they want it to be, but just, well, we've called the, the other organization, we've had a few meetings, and this is really where we get stuck. There's no space for us to get together and to collaborate. There's no this or that or the other. So those are the things I'd be looking for the executive team to really be talking about, if the agency is struggling with it.
Excellent.
So I'm going to scroll a little bit through here. So close your eyes if you're prone to vertigo there as I'm scrolling. Moving into work incentives planning. So we're in the services section now of the Fidelity Scale, which is, so here's something I'll tell you too. So I have noticed organizations, each of these sections of the Fidelity Scale kind of evaluate a certain thing. So the services section really evaluates how well the team is at doing supported employment, right? We just finished the organization section, which evaluates how hardwired IPS is in the organization. And then the first section is staffing and basically how do you set up the team. So usually this is not where, scores, really struggling scores happen. Usually, for the most part, this services section is where, if it's been a challenge for folks from a scoring perspective for agencies, this is usually where it starts to shake out and get a little better, because this is the easiest thing to, I shouldn't say the easiest, but it's the thing that the employment specialists and the supervisor have the most control over. How do you work with the client one-on-one and help them get a job? So these are things that the team has kind of direct responsibility over. So work incentives planning, it's exactly what it sounds like. The idea is that clients are offered assistance in getting their benefits planning done prior to starting a new job, and thereafter when making decisions about changing anything, work hours, pay, etc. This is really not walking somebody down to the Social Security office and having an appointment there. This is working with trained people who, they know things that are very, very specific to the different funding methods that are out there. And there are people who, I think we did talk about this last time. Yeah, there's very specific training that a benefits planner could have, and there's a link to it in the Fidelity Manual, Fidelity Review Manual. Often, the best evidence of this is that there is kind of like a sheet, a worksheet that someone gets at the end that results from their benefits planning session, and agencies that hardwire it and do it very well put that right into the chart. They maybe give the hard copy to the client, but make a photocopy to go into the chart. So that would be what you'd see. Every client won't meet with a benefits planner. Some clients don't want to. You're going to have people who don't have any benefits, so there's really not any benefit to plan. So there's a lot of ways. You're not going in and looking for 100%. You're going in and looking that there's evidence that it was offered to each client that's coming through the team. So for a score of a 5 here, you're going to see evidence that the IPS employment specialist offers assistance in getting these benefits planned by a specially trained work incentives planner prior to starting a job. So just that we've offered it. The offer might be in the progress notes or the contact notes, but they might have a checkbox on some other document that says client, declined or client agreed, here's the date. As I look at the examples, let's see here. Yeah, basic information really gives you a 3. I'm looking at that first one there. I have seen kind of a shift over time. So trained benefits planners are getting more and more difficult to have readily available in states. Some are retiring, and I don't think there's many people kind of getting that distinction like there maybe was at one point. And so I have seen an increase in IPS agencies sending someone from their employment team to get the training, so they have an in-house benefits planner. And so that's a unique and innovative arrangement. I applaud agencies that do that. It's an expensive training, and the way they set that up is they're the in-house benefits planner, they're an employment specialist, but they will work with other employment specialist clients to do the benefits planning. And the good thing about that is you can make it more readily available that way. The bad thing about that is if many agencies start to do that, then there won't be, like in Illinois, we have a handful of state kind of quote unquote certified benefits planners. So if agencies use them less frequently, there will be less of a reason to keep them on, and they will lose that as a state option. So there's kind of a balance there. When there's kind of state certified benefits planners, we'll talk with that state certified benefits planner. Even if they're from out of town, we might have a phone call with them. If it's somebody local, certainly we'd want to do a face-to-face. Let's see here, other things that are worth noting here. This example, when IPS specialists don't help any of their workers with their monthly reporting, we don't score higher than a 4 there. So we are looking for more than just the one visit with the benefits planner. We want to know about what's their benefits planning process and what happens after the agency, or what happens after the appointment for the client with regards to benefit reporting and ongoing work for their benefits. I just have says I'm going in and out. Let me adjust my microphone. Thank you, Lori. Are you guys able to hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you, Paul.
Okay. It is so such a challenge with webinars. You never quite know if it's on my end or a listener's end or all of the above. And so thank you, Lori, for pointing that out. I'm going to try to keep my microphone close. I'm Italian, and I don't think I've ever had anybody tell me that. I'm not used to people telling me they have trouble hearing me. So if we were on video, you'd see my hand movements too. Let's move into disclosure. I think we did briefly touch on this last time, if I remember correctly. Disclosure sounds pretty easy. This is, the idea is employment specialists are helping clients evaluate their choice and make an informed decision regarding what they reveal to an employer about having a disability. So again, we have components here. Now there's 4 components instead of 5, so that's a little bit different. And when I flip over to the Fidelity scoring sheet, a score of 5 means 4 items are present. You've been able to score 4. A score of 4 is 3 are present. A score of 3 is 2 are present. A score of 2 is 1 is present, and they get a 1 if 0 are present. And so really, this one's a little more straightforward, I think, than some of the ones we've talked about so far. So employment specialists don't require disclosure. You would see evidence that there's a discussion about disclosure, multiple discussions about disclosure, and probably discussions per employer. So if they go to Target today, you'd expect to see a disclosure conversation about Target. But if they want to go to Walmart and talk about a job tomorrow, maybe you'd expect to see a different discussion about disclosure at Walmart. So it is sort of this ongoing, ever-evolving discussion about disclosure. And again, best practices, you would see evidence that clients are choosing to disclose certain things with certain employers based on whatever the context is at that employer. The second component here is that we discuss the costs and benefits, or the pros and cons. I'll put a plug out right now, and I do this in Fidelity reviews too. There is a great pros and cons worksheet at ipsworks.org. And when it is unclear or not perfect for this component, the first recommendation I have is they should use the pros and cons worksheet, period. It goes right into the chart, and you just do it for every conversation, and you revisit it periodically, and it's easy to have this component hardwired. The component is just specific information, like I talked about a few seconds ago, whether that's receiving treatment or presence of a disability, or couching it in terms like difficulty with anxiety, examples of how you could tailor disclosure. You'd see great stuff of tailoring that disclosure. And then the last component is you see employment specialists discussing disclosure on more than one occasion. Again, that's different employers. Even if somebody hasn't really found an employment yet, I think a fairly common thing you would see is if somebody's really struggling to find employment, say after 90 days, you might see a discussion with the client where the employment specialist is talking about, pros and cons of disclosing where the client didn't disclose before, with the idea that the employment specialist maybe can help through some of the things they're struggling with. I mean, maybe they're really tanking interviews, or they're, they haven't wanted any help on how to get better at an interview or interacting with an employer. Those are things that we can have a discussion with the client about, and really help them along, through that kind of motivational interviewing method of helping them realize what we can offer for them. And as you might imagine, the sources of information include, record reviews, specifically progress notes or contact notes. I always ask the client group, you usually interview a client group in a Fidelity review. I always ask them, was it required that you disclosed anything about your mental health treatment? Routinely hear no. And then that leads you into territory like, well, how did you decide what to disclose? And then you really hear right from the client what I think is the best evidence of how the employment specialist has the discussion with them. So that would be a place that's really rich with evidence for this item, in my opinion. Yeah, and I think the pros and cons worksheet is called this plan for approaching employers. Well, that's at the end of the manual too. So just using this worksheet, we'll get at least a 3 for organizations, or something even similar. Let's see, when they use a comprehensive disclosure worksheet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, reviewers rate 4 or higher. So for a score of 5, reviewers must also find evidence that IPS specialists discuss disclosure with some people on more than one occasion. And that's really why you want to have those discussions, both in the client interviews, you want to look in the records, and when you're talking with employment specialists, it's important to understand some of these nuances in order to arrive at a very accurate score for them. And I'll put out there again, if anyone has questions about anything we're talking about, you are welcome to put them right into the questions area. Work-based vocational assessment is the next item, and this is essentially the vocational assessment or career profile should occur over 2 to 3 sessions, should be updated. Most organizations have a very comprehensive career profile already, which is great. Organizations struggle with evidence that it was done over 2 to 3 sessions, and they struggle with evidence that it's been updated with information from work experience and competitive jobs. So it wouldn't be uncommon at all for you to see a career profile that's dated, September 1st, and it's in the medical record. And when you ask the employment specialist, do you update it? How long do you update it regularly? They say yes. When you ask the employment specialists about, do you do it in one session, or does it take you more than one session? They will tell you it usually takes 2 to 3 sessions, but yet when you see it, it says September 1 on it for a date. And so probably about every other organization ends up with me sending a recommendation with the Fidelity report that says, what they need to do is just sign it, if they did it on September 1st, that's great. Like that's when they finished it, but they should, every time they touch it, they should just put a new signature, a new date on it. That would be enough to show that it's updated, to show that they review it over multiple sessions. And so it's, for this one, for me, it really ends up being about the evidence, because we're all hardwired to sign a document when we're done with it. In this particular scenario, we just need to see a little more evidence that they've done it. Now, you might have 2 or 3 progress notes over the course of a week or 2 that show you that it is completed, even though the career profile says one date, and that's okay too. But a real easy way to show it is just have folks sign it every time they touch it. I don't think I've been to an organization where it's only one session and they don't ever look at it again. The practice is very, very different at every organization I've been to. The examples are pretty straightforward. There's really not a lot of things to look out for when scoring this one. So I'm going to keep moving through this one. Rapid search for competitive job. Okay, so for this one, we want to have people in front of an employer, right, for within 30 days. That's the standard. So this one, you're going to hear about it verbally from the IPS supervisor, probably. You might hear about it from the employment specialists, and maybe that's a goal they talk about in supervision, and that's great. But you will see for this particular item, so for a score of 5 on this item, the program tracks employer contacts and the first face-to-face contact with an employer by the client or the employment specialist on average within 30 days after program entry. So to score this one appropriately, you need to know a couple things. You need to know, what does the IPS organization consider quote-unquote program entry? And you might be surprised to hear that this often can be a real source of confusion in discussions with the organization. Some will tell you program entry is when they get the referral. Some will tell you program entry is when they show for their first appointment with the employment team. And each of those has its own sort of consequence regarding the data. So if they say when they get the referral, That's the program entry date. That's fine. It's not wrong. But like the clock starts there for 30 days. So if they take 5 days to get somebody in for an appointment after they receive the referral, now they've got 25 days to get them in front of an employer. So this is important to walk organizations through and help them understand how the scoring, how their practice impacts the scoring. Likewise, if it's the first appointment they show for, that's fine, but they're able to, I mean, really, you can't do any work for somebody if they're not there yet. So I encourage IPS organizations to try to use as much common sense about this one, not to game it or anything like that, but to be fair to themselves, really. So a few things before I talk specifically about the scoring. In this item, we're going to ask the IPS supervisor if they track the number of days from when the client first meets an IPS specialist to the first employer contact. If they don't, they cannot score higher than a 4. If it's spotty, then we need to understand those differences, or if it's inconsistent, we need to understand those differences. And just to go back real quickly, it says here to calculate rapid job search, use the date of the client's first appointment with the IPS specialist as a program entry date. That's what I advocate to organizations who say it's when the referral comes in, if they want to really get their scoring kind of accurate for this. So in this one, for those of you that got into this field to avoid math, I have bad news. We are going to do a little math here. So the way you score it is during your record reviews, you're going to be reviewing clients who are in the job search phase, people who are employed, et cetera, and you're going to use some of that information for this item. So you're going to determine the median. So the median is a little different than an average or a mean. The median is really the kind of dead center, and it allows us to really prevent, a super high number and a super low number from really messing with the score. And the example I'll give you is if we have scores that range from 0 to 100, the average might be 50. But if we have scores that range from 0 to 100 and they're all clustered around 60, 62, 68, 71, the median is going to be much closer to that cluster of scores than it is to 50. And so it's a way to have a little bit more context to a string of numbers. So to calculate the median, it's very easy. You rank the numbers from lowest to highest that you've got from your record reviews. The median number is in the middle of that list. If there's an even number of days listed, you got to add the 2 middle numbers. It goes into some examples here. So here's IPS supervisor does not track the number of days to first employer contact. Reviewers read client records and find the following, this string of numbers. So what you do is there's an even number of examples, so they have to average the 2 numbers in the middle because there's not one number that's dead in the middle here. So they take that average, and that is their mean, the median is 30 days, but because the supervisor doesn't track the information, they can only score a 4. So you can see here with this string of numbers, they had 1, 2, 3, 5, they had 10 charts that were reviewed, and only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them were higher than 30, right? So half of them were not within the 30 days we wanted it. So an average would have given them a much different look at what their score was. This is a realistic score. The median, the right in the middle, is 30 days. So I want people to kind of think about that. We'll go through another example. If you have questions about it, that's fine. I'm certainly not a math major or anything like that. So if you ask me tough math questions, I will not be able to answer them. I'll have to get my 13-year-old to help. But it is not as complicated as it sounds. And I only am going slow here because some Fidelity reviewers that I've worked with, for whatever reason, this is really a challenge for them to kind of understand. So think about it this way. If you're on a Fidelity review and you're doing chart reviews, you need to understand how many days between their program entry, and first employer contact. So you just write down that number. If we just go with this example that we're looking at the top of the page, the first chart you review, it was 2 days. The second chart you review, it was 6 days. The third chart, it was 7 days. Once you get all of your charts reviewed, you rank all of those days from low to high, so 2, 6, 7, 8, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then once you've done that, all you're going to do, there's really not any arithmetic or anything like that. You just count how many total numbers you have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And so you just pick the number that is right in the middle of these 13. And so it's 33 because there's 6 on one side and 6 on the other, period. That's how you, quote unquote, calculate the median. There is, if you're a Microsoft Excel wizard, there is a formula you can put into Excel, will result in the median for you, but most people, if you just write them out low to high, you can just circle the number that's right in the middle. So here's another one where you've got an even number. When you've got an odd total number of charts, you have to average the middle 2 because there's not an exact middle of an even string of numbers. So averaging 25 and 28 gets you 26.5, which is less than 30, and the supervisor tracks the data, so the score is 5 on this second example. Does that make sense to folks? Or do we want to stick on this for a minute?
You know, I'm gonna add a little piece.
Go for it.
Darren and I have subscribed to the Fidelity Review report writing tool that IPS has. There's a subscription to that for IPS trainers. And the nice thing is, if I put in all those numbers, it's going to calculate the median and the score for me. So we now know how to do it, and we now know that the Fidelity report writing tool also does it for us, because I'm one of those folks you mentioned, Paul, that is a social worker, because I can't be a mathematician, so they figured that into the process too, thankfully.
Yeah, it's a good way to get counselors and social workers to stop talking so much as you put numbers in front of them, right? I think that was part of the problem.
Yeah. And have them go home.
And you know, a median is such a I mean, this is like the only place I can think of that calculating a median is in my life. I don't know that there's another place where I have to calculate a median, so it's certainly not something that I think most people have experience with. Once you do it a few times, it's a little bit easier, and like I said, it's not long division or anything like that. It's just kind of making sense of it. And the other thing too is when you're looking through chart reviews, it's really important to make sure you can find the number. Often it's difficult to find the number if there is an agency that doesn't track job development in a meaningful way. You're going to struggle to find the number, and that's going to be a real challenge. That's going to be something you really have to try to explore with the organization so that you can score this item.
Yeah, we've run into that a couple of times lately in Fidelity reviews. And I know we send out an example of it's both a participant log and a job development log that kind of has all that stuff in one. And I can send it out also with, you know, our thanks for attending email that we typically send out once people have been in one of these. But I can't stress strongly enough how big a tool it is for the employment specialists, how important a tool it is for the supervisors and for the agencies to have a tracking tool like that, because a couple of agencies reviewed recently got a very low score on that one when they could have aced it, but just because they didn't have a tool for job development.
Right. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to move on. If somebody, you know, if a question occurs regarding that rapid search, just go ahead and put that right in the questions bar. We can get it answered. We want to make sure we get it answered for folks, any questions they have. So individualized job search is the next one. And this is, you know, hardwired into the principles of IPS, right? So we want to make sure that we get a good job match We want to pay attention to preferences, pay attention to needs, and we want, you know, a job search plan that's updated like the career profile, you know, based on experience and education that they get. In an ideal world, you've got a job search plan that is right there in the chart, and it gives you all of this information. Not every organization is there yet today. So, you know, they may have a job search plan that tells you some of this information, but not all of it. And so you rely on interviews to get the rest of the information, maybe other parts of the documentation or the record. Let's see here. There's some flexibility here with, you know, if people don't want the IPS specialist to talk to employers on their behalf, the IPS specialists will independently learn about requirements of different jobs. This is with somebody's permission for sure. And so again, it's got some, it's prescriptive, but there's flexibility in the prescriptiveness of it, you know. So the idea is you want plans that include preferences and what they'll do to find a job, but what we don't want is canned text that, you know, all the job search plans look the same. There are multiple examples of sample job search plans, both in this manual and on IPS Works website. And then another thing we want to really make sure of is that it's updated.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
I just got, and I tend to check email during these presentations because sometimes people get kicked out and need help getting back in. And Asia says, the chat box isn't working. What is scoring looking like for rapid search for COVID as it is slow going with employers?
Oh, good question. Let me scroll back up to the rapid search. So people who get to know me realize that I don't answer questions very directly often. So each agency kind of struggles in their own way, and I think there's context that is very important with regards to rapid job search for a competitive job. And the context I'm thinking about in particular is, you know, very rural agencies that serve very rural areas already have limitations with the number of employers they're able to connect with. And then if you add a layer of COVID-19 response on top of that, it tends to be a real challenge for those very rural organizations in a lot of different ways. And this would be one of the ways, rapid job search. For, you know, major metro areas, that's not as much of an issue. Really, it comes back to, though, what do you see? What is the evidence? So in rapid job search for competitive job, you know, it counts if the job or if the employment specialist is talking with a hiring manager on behalf of a client. So I think really where the kind of COVID-19 challenges will occur for this item are going to be for organizations who have dealt with furloughs. I think, you know, fewer people doing the work, I just sense will see that number creep up a little bit. However, you know, it's fair to say, as we saw in the first example there, you know, this example right here, you know, they have in one of their records, it was 94 days between program entry and getting in front of an employer, which seems, you know, like we would not be happy with that. And I'm not saying they were happy with it, but overall, that didn't impact their score too terribly because of the way that the Fidelity Scale has us calculating the median. So there certainly will be an impact. I am absolutely certain of it. I will tell you, though, I haven't done a Fidelity review. I think the last Fidelity review I did was in early February, and then in Illinois, where I'm a Fidelity reviewer, we've kind of just put a pause on Fidelity reviews currently. So
and Washington does not. And actually, one of the ways that we've kind of dealt with this for Asia and the crew is that we've allowed, and it's getting so far out now, it's probably not as meaningful, but we've allowed agencies to send us job development logs and timeout calendars with timeout and community and that kind of thing from February in order to see what was happening prior to COVID. for at least the time being when we're looking at that kind of thing. That was the only way we could come up that would be fair. That would be fair to agencies if we're looking at doing things face to face. I know that the agencies that are still open, and there were a few that closed, are doing a lot of phone and virtual employer contacts. And Paul, in the state of Washington, our counties are on a county by county basis as far as reopening after COVID, based on how few cases they've had recently. And so some counties are actually opening up again, where they're starting to get to contact employers face to face, whereas they couldn't for a while. So it's sort of ending up being a real individualized kind of thing. When we talk to, because what we've been doing is virtual, we have a meeting with the agency and ask them, where are you at? What are you doing at this point in time? And how can we set this up? And what's going to, what platforms are we going to use when we do a review, and that kind of thing. And it's ending up being quite individualized from the standpoint of that kind of thing. So hopefully that makes sense. And I see Asia said the chat box is not working. Would some of you try and do just a quick entry into the chat box to see if we've got it back or if it's still not working? And I'm going to kind of keep a watch on that. And hopefully I'll see something here momentarily. Spokane still in phase 2, I see from Lori. Yep. I think it's a lot of the more rural counties that are in phase 3 where they're actually getting to go out and start to talk to employers and things. We talked to a couple of agencies recently that were in that phase, so they were able to go out and start talking to employers. So Lori was able to use the chat. Can anybody else do so?
Dawn, I put a test chat out there. I don't see it, so I don't know if it's landed.
I don't see it. Yeah, no, I don't see it either. I did see the one from Lori, but I don't see anything else at this point in time. So if you have a question, go ahead and send. Pardon me?
This is Darren. I actually see Paul to entire audience test.
Okay.
Okay. I don't see Paul still, but I just saw one.
I know what I did.
Is that the organizers?
Yeah, I think I answered somebody's question with test instead of doing a new.
I do see
one.
that.
Whoops-a-daisy.
Looks like our chat again. So sorry about that, Paul. I just wanted to let folks know if for some reason the chat's not working. I thought Asia was brilliant in sending me an email.
Yeah, definitely.
If it's just working again, go ahead and feel free to do that, and I'll just check it periodically and read those if it has to go that way. There's always a solution, huh? Job developers, employment specialists are creative. You are a creative bunch, and I'm impressed.
It is. Well, job search plan, ideally what you're seeing is that the client has preferences for a gym, might be a dishwasher, a restaurant, and I want to work in retail. And so that job search would include dishwashing, restaurants and retail positions. If they're in a job or the job search that is updated, and they'd say, oh yeah, well, he also said whatever I can hired for first. And that's a reality you might see. Are based.
So one thing I'm going to say, while it appears, and maybe it's me, that is having the difficulties. I don't. Oh, there, I heard you.
So just said my audio connection was restored, and I didn't know it was even. Can you,
could, and I think now it's gone again.
Now it's gone again.
Yeah. So folks, what I'm going to say is that on another. Audio connection. Yep, I see that. Mine went in and out too, evidently. So I was just saying, Paul, I don't know if you heard me that I have the, for after the break, I have the participant interview video queued up. I know there's been some difficulties with also making the audio work, so I'm going to try using my phone and computer and hoping for not a bunch of feedback. So we'll see how that goes.
Okay.
If we can't do the video, we can't do the video, being that creative group of folks I just mentioned that we were. We'll figure out something else, like sending out the links to folks, and they're very short videos, but helpful. So if we can't show them, you'll at least have the links to be able to look at them yourselves.
And I also have pulled up the videos from our slide deck, Dawn.
Oh, marvelous. Good, good, good.
So in my prep, I pulled those up. So one way or the other, we should be good to go for the videos. So let me, do you want me just to finish up my thoughts on the job search real quickly, and then we keep moving?
You bet.
Okay, I've got, it
Absolutely.
looks like maybe about 15 minutes before a break, or maybe 10 minutes, depending on when you started your clock. So I said a 5 was 90 to 100% for the job search, 4 is 75 to 89%, 3 is 50 to 74. So, you know, if you review 10 charts, for example, and 8 of them, that's an 80%, you know, so you'd be looking at a score 4, 79 to 89, 75 to 89%. Contacts by the employment specialist are based on the job choices, which reflect preferences. So that scoring is not so bad. That's just, you know, how many out of 10 did you get? So we're moving into job development, frequent employer contact. So I'll just start by saying, if you go to an organization for a review and they don't have any employer contact logs, you're going to really struggle on multiple items, but specifically on this one. So on this one, we want to see that an employment specialist is making at least 6 face-to-face employer contacts per week on behalf of clients. And the way they put the scoring right in the definition here, you rate the score for each. Well, I shouldn't say score. You do the contacts per week for each employment specialist, and then you average among however many employment specialists they have, and you use the closest scale point. So, so what you do here is, for a score of 5, it's 6 or more, easy peasy. For a score of 4, it's 5 that are client specific, 5 employer contacts. For a score of 3, it's 4 face-to-face employer contacts. And so the way that looks is, if Darren and Dawn and Paul are employment specialists, and Dawn has, I'm just going to make up some numbers. Dawn has 4 employer contacts per week, would give our organization a score of 3 on the Fidelity scale. So it's literally that simple. And let's see here. So in the Fidelity Review Manual here, it says here, here's how we arrive at it. You read 2 months of employer contact forms for each employment specialist. And you really want to make sure that you're looking at contacts with hiring managers, somebody with a hiring authority. You don't include contacts with no hiring authority. Email, phone contact. You would include contacts where the employment specialist and the job seeker did it together. Client only contact, which means clients and the employment specialist is not present, would not be included in the calculation.
Job development and outreach and that kind of thing from prior to COVID.
Sure.
So it's a dance. We're dancing right now, and there is nothing about COVID that's allowed us to be just kind of normal and business as usual. And I think everybody down to the individual has done their best in regards to the dance to figure out how to deal with this. This also being a piece of that. And so, what we figured out to hopefully best deal with it was look at records prior to COVID. With this coming up in October, I'm hoping we'll be able to do, something other than that, and that we'll be able to look at phone contact, because that's what employment specialists across the nation, it just is. And I know from the agency standpoint, HCA is having all of us do telework through the end of the year. So this isn't going to change real rapidly. This is our life right at the moment. So I'm hoping to see that feedback that we get from the IPS folks allows phone. So we shall see.
Yeah, and I would imagine, if you're going to include phone, you'd have to have some other. I guess I would expect from a reviewer's perspective, if you allow for phone, you'd have to see maybe some evidence elsewhere other than just a job development log. If that makes, I guess what I'm going for here is, I'm thinking of my own organization. If I was going to count a phone contact with a hiring manager as job development, I'd expect to maybe see also a contact note which would mean, it lasted more than 7.5 minutes. And you've got something you can go on more than, because really those job development logs, they tell you some information, but not an awful lot.
Well, where I'm truly going to look, Paul, is that I'm going to look at that list of jobs that people have gotten over a period of time. And if you're doing phone employer contact, then that better be resulting in jobs over a period of time.
That's a good point.
If it is, great. If it's not, then you would question whether that phone contact is working and maybe how you could do it differently. And that's something we've talked with employment specialists on the job developers community of practice about using LinkedIn, about using, virtual if you can, about networking with employers in various ways. Just keep those going. And certainly phone, where you have a relationship already established, hopefully does work well. And phone in general may, because employers it's very different for them too. So, where I say we have to kind of be adaptive almost down to the individual level, we really do, and still try and maintain fidelity.
Yeah. I would imagine IPS Works won't budge a ton on what the scale is. There'll be some considerations, though, I'm sure. There has to be for what we're dealing with right now. So let just idea, especially so we're item here where we rate each employment specialist and then average and use the closest scale point. So for this one, and it's the same sort of rubric with regards to quality, like how you rate it. So we're going to look at probably the same exact items we just talked about: employer contact logs. We're going to observe the IPS team meeting with employers. We're going to talk with the supervisor, the employment specialist. And so really what this quality kind of gets at is that you see as a reviewer that they put in the shortest way I could put it is they put in the work. They put in the work in order to have the relationship with the employer. So you're going to go see job development. You're going to observe. I would love to see, every time I do job development shadowing, I love to see an existing employer relationship. I love to see somebody that they're kind of starting a relationship with. Maybe they only had a couple visits. And then I love to see a cold call where we're literally just driving around and they pop into an employer. And then it gives me an opportunity to talk with the employment specialist about, why did you pick this employer? And maybe it's because they're working with somebody who loves video games and GameStop is hiring. So now they're going to GameStop. They've never met with GameStop before. Those are all things that are just great on this. It's here. That's really awkward not being in the conversation. I encourage them to say, I'm here for training. So, he's going to watch how I work with you. And it's kind of like, well, there's a setup for me just to be lurking in the corner. Gosh. But, with very little exception, they all go very well. If for whatever reason you can't observe an employment specialist doing job development, you can only give them a 1. And so this is really important for us to tell organizations, if they don't have job development scheduled, that's fine if you don't want to schedule it, but I literally cannot give you more than a score of 1. Even if you're great at it, I can't give you a score of more than 1. Again, as long as you're fully informing people, they're going to schedule whatever they're going to schedule for whatever time they want to schedule. I'm always cautious too as a reviewer. I always ask the team when I get the schedule on day 1, when I see job development shadowing on there, I always ask, are these scheduled appointments with an employer, or did you tell them you're going to stop by after 11 a.m., for example? Because what I don't want to do is have a meeting run long before job development, which causes the employment specialist to be late. Did the time scheduled to see the employer? I don't want us doing them that fall. So they have to relationships. If it's then has to for us to be there on the variables here. These full May relationship isn't there, and so those are all things worth best
Hi, everybody. I don't know if I'll mention what I mentioned, what we kind of went in is once Paul gets to the point of starting videos, that if folks would let me know right away whether you can hear it or not, because audio is one of the things in GoToWebinar that doesn't always work with the videos. I will also say, for those of you that are being so persistent and sticking in with us, the HCA is looking at purchasing a different platform, which I hope will happen sooner rather than later, so that we have better luck with these kinds of things. Says my network connection's been reestablished. Peachy.
Well, all right.
So, Paul, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Dawn. I will also